Hi, I'm Dr. Annette Childs, and I'd like to welcome you to the audio version of my book, Will You Dance? Many years ago, after having spent more than a decade as a bereavement therapist, grief entered my own life unexpectedly. And with it came the universal journey that we all take when change, loss, and fear arrive onto the doorstep of our world. So despite the fact that I had devoted my life's work to the grieving, and despite the many credentials and certifications that I held, as the tides of grief rolled in, I found myself awash in the same seas that I had watched so many of my own patients struggle to navigate. As the first year of the loss came to a close, I sat down one afternoon with the intention of writing a Christmas letter to our family and friends. My intention was simply to share with them the journey that we had taken. For the next 3 hours, I wrote. And when my hands finally came to rest on my keyboard, what sat before me were the words that now comprise my multi-award-winning book called Will You Dance? This tiny book that I never intended has made its way into the heart and the soul of grievers the world over. And there's a great consensus among those who read it that there's a special alchemy in the phrasing. And this is something that I agree with. If I had intended to write a book about grief, I think the book would have turned out very different. Deliberation changes things. It tightens up the fluidity of the moment, and it can strangle the authenticity that is such an important part of connection. I never meant to write a book. I simply opened up my heart and gave an honest telling of where we had been. Today, almost 20 years has passed since I first published this little book. And today, my life is happy and complete. So a few days ago, when I stood in my closet with a makeshift microphone and read this book out loud, I did so only with the intention that I would send my amateur and hastily done recording off to a professional poet. He could use my sample as a reference for how I wished for him to read the book, but that was my only intention. Well, in my life, the universe is nothing if it is not predictable. And I'll be darned if I did not, once again, fall for the same cosmic trick. I truly had no intention of ever recording Will You Dance as an audiobook in my own voice. I struggle to read out loud, and the technical aspects of recording always elude me. So the thought of doing it on my own really never occurred. So as I stood and read Will You Dance word for word, there was not one part of my being that was engaged in trying to create an audiobook. I hadn't read the book myself in well over a decade, and I was completely unprepared for what occurred. It was just like what happened when I had sat down to write my Christmas letter. As I began to speak the words, it took me back. It took me back to the year 2000, when my knock on the door came and my own journey had begun. When I self-published Will You Dance, all those years ago, prior to publishing, I made the grave error of sending my inspired words to a professional editor. Well, my heartfelt torrent of words came back with a sticky note on the front of the binder that warned me that my syntax was horrible and my sentence structure was bad. He kindly suggested that I put my work away and use it only for personal reference, so as not to embarrass myself if I released it out into the world. Well, maybe it was because life had already taken from me all the things that I thought would ever matter. But the strong words of that editor, well, they rolled off me like water off a duck's back. I spell-checked my little book, and like a child who was gently placing my paper boat upon the water, I gave that book a little nudge, and I let it move out into the world. And do you know what? The winds of fate, they caught its sails. And today, 18 years later, Will You Dance has sold more than 10,000 copies, and it's been the recipient of 7 national and international literary awards. And my little, imperfect, unintended diamond in the rough story, well, I'm afraid it's now become an imperfect, unintended diamond in the rough audiobook. I never sent it off to that poet. Yep, the version that you will listen to is the one that I made that day in my closet, standing in my slippers, completely unaware that just like on the day of its writing, I was about to be transported into a place between worlds. You are about to be transported too. So the recording, it may be imperfect, but the story and the telling of that story, it's very real. Some may call it fiction, while others will simply answer the call. I present to you now, Will You Dance, as published by the Wandering Feather Press and read by the author.
It seemed like an ordinary day, but years later, when we looked back upon it, our memories insist that it was unusually still in the world on that late summer morning. Now, whether time has created our notions or our notions have created time, we each seem to remember a slow motion quality to that day. Like the clock was dragging its hands a bit, wishing to let us savor every last moment of our lives before that knock on the door came and our journey began. Tap, 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 like the lazy thump that comes from the tail of a half-sleeping dog who long ago gave up notions of chasing anything other than its own black and white dreams. Harder now. Tap, tap, tap. The knock on the door was destiny, and we had no choice but to answer. Before us stood 3 hooded figures. Their faces we could not see. It took only moments for us to realize who it was that stood before us. On our doorstep stood change, and behind change stood fear. And next to fear was loss. We tried to explain that surely they must be mistaken. But they stood firm until there was nothing left to do but invite them in. The first to enter was change, and with her she brought a gust of wind that swept away all of the familiar things that we had known in our world.